Hi, fragrances of the 90s. The 90s. What a magical time. 90s were a very, extremely boring time. A very unmemorable time. Actually, if you want to think about world events, the 90s have probably had the least in any decade in modern times. At the start of the decade, we saw the fall of the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall, and a war in the Middle East that was over before it started. Even the long-running Lebanese civil war ended. People were also starting to recover from the financial collapse of the 80s, all of which left people with an outlook of optimism. There was hardly any cocaine left because the 80s had snorted it all. And the emergence of AIDS means that people were scared of fucking everything that moved. The 90s trudged along, happy to kick the proverbial can down the road for 10 years. It even ended with a whimper, when all that fuss and furor over the Y2K bug being the bringer of the end of the world all ended up being no big deal at all. Socially, we were moving away from the brash, hairy-chestedness of the 80s and more towards political correctness. Men were being revered for being more like women, and women were being revered for being more like men. The androgyny was real. Musically, grunge, gangster rap, neo-soul, and electronic music like house came to the fray. Genres were being mishmashed together. Elements of music that didn't belong together were actually belonging together. Notable mentions are way too many, but my favorite from the era was The Future by Guy, Diary of a Madman by Jodeci, Brown Sugar by D'Angelo, Maxwell's Urban Hang Suite, 12 Play by R. Kelly, and Technotronic's first album, which is still an absolute banger. Cinematically, we were looking inwards because we had satisfied the lower rungs on the hierarchy of needs and started exploring our inner selves. There were no big wars to fight, so no existential boogeymen to contend with. Ever notice the lack of blockbuster action movies in the 90s as compared to the 80s? Notable mentions like Fight Club, Office Space, and the literal timeless Groundhog Day are perfect examples of these. Fashionally, people were moving away from high-end designer clothing, favoring cheaper brands and pairing them with a designer piece or two. And to counter that, designers got really desperate and put on big, lavish fashion shows, which further exacerbated the problem because anyone with more sense than money looked at these massive extravaganzas like multi-million-dollar novelties. Fragrantically, I'm going to copyright that word. The traditional staple notes of oak moss, which is a fungus, civet, which is the anus juice of a cat, musk, which is the testicle juice of a deer, pine, which is the juice of a lumberjack, strong woods, which is the juice of a man in the morning, and leather, which is the juice of a village person. These ingredients formed the majority of the powerhouse fragrances of the 80s, and they were out. In were the fragrance notes that were soft and mellow and unassuming and unremarkable, and judging by how many of them are still in production, unforgettable. In my view, this all culminated artistically in 1995, which I think is when the decade found its stride and identity, but mainly because people had stopped wearing happy pants by then. The designer houses kind of got used to expecting a certain market to be there, and when that market all of a sudden decided to buy no-name, cheap, no-brand clothing and things like comfort wear, the divide between what the designers thought would be fashion that year and what actually ended up as fashion became glaringly apparent. But fragrances aren't made in the year that they're released. They're prepared years in advance sometimes. These things take time. So the fragrances that were released in 1995 were made with the expectation that the trends of the earlier years would continue on. But in 1995, the trends pivoted. But the fragrances were released anyway. So let's take a little look at some of the fragrances that were released and actually gained popularity in the year of 1995. Remember, there was no niche market back then because there was no need for it. There was no need for it. And so now I haven't ranked these in any kind of order other than the popular vote, let's say. Okay, so we're going to start off with the first one. That is this one. It is Jean Paul Gaultier's Le Male, a clubbing scent. That doesn't mean that you wore it when you went out to the clubs. What I'm saying is that it was so strong that when you smelled it, you felt like you'd been beaten with a club. Next up is Silver Mountain Water by Creed. Back when Creed was the epitome of the highest heights of perfumery, sparing no expense in search of utmost quality. Now, Armaf's sillage is undeniably the better overall proposition. Lancôme Poème. My mother had a bottle of this, and I remember thinking it was a fantastic smelling fragrance even as a teenager. Must have been damn good, and I'm pretty sure that it's been reformulated to water right now. Creed's Militiam Imperial. That's right, Creed released Silver Mountain Water and Militiam Imperial in the same year. Two absolute bangers and staples of any fragrance collector's collection. And yes, Militiam Imperial is possibly one of the GOAT's greatest of all time fragrance releases. And word has it that this was Michael Jordan's signature fragrance. The GOAT was wearing the GOAT? Yves Saint Laurent's Opium Eau de Toilette and Eau de Parfum, both released in 1995. I miss the old Yves Saint Laurent, when they were the punks of the designer world, especially the designer fragrance world, because things like Kouros and Body Kouros and the original Opium from 1977 even, M7, Rive Gauche, both men's and women's, Jazz. And then in 1995, when everyone else was doing light, airy, fairy, unisex-ish kind of fragrances, they dropped what is arguably the greatest oriental spicy fragrance of all time, Opium Eau De Parfum. I hardly ever use the term masterpiece to describe a fragrance, but really there is no other way to describe this scent. If you know, you know. Tommy Hilfiger, Tommy. Iconic. Still here, and there's a reason for that. Givenchy Sirius Rouge. Timeless, timeless, timeless. I can't call it a classic. I just can't because it's timeless. You can't call it a classic. Though I think it does deserve a modern niche interpretation. That would be absolutely game-changing. Axe Africa, also known as Lynx Africa here in Australia. The smell of high school boys all over the Western world. Laugh all you want, but this tonka-heavy beast is the unlikely predecessor to all of these vanilla tonka fragrances that are all the rage these days. I never wore it, I didn't like it, and I don't like it. But I respect it. And as it is with fragrances, it is with most everything else. Just because you dislike something doesn't mean you disrespect it. And that's absolutely fine. It was fine in 1995, and it still is now.